Hello beautiful people, I'm Sarah Red, and in this video we'll talk about macromolecules, which are large molecules made of smaller molecules. Many of the foods we eat, such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, are actually macromolecules. Nutrients are molecules we get from our food. We can classify them as either macronutrients or micronutrients. The prefix macro means big. These are the nutrients we need in large amounts. They include carbohydrates, like sugars and starches, lipids, like fats and oils, and proteins, which are extremely diverse. The main way we use our macronutrients is to break them down, which releases the energy that powers your body's processes. Things like muscle movement, sending electrical messages in your brain, and building new molecules and cells. The pieces of these macronutrients can also be put together to make new molecules that your body needs. Different macronutrients release different amounts of energy when you break them down. Carbohydrates and proteins release 4 calories for every gram of nutrient that is broken down. Fats release 9 calories per gram, so you receive more than twice as much energy from a gram of fat as from a gram of carbohydrate or protein. If you eat more food than you need to power your body's energy needs, the extra will be converted to fat and stored for later. Most foods contain a combination of carbs, fats, and proteins, but can have a lot more of one kind than another. For example, the fruit in this picture is mostly carbohydrates and water, and only has a very tiny amount of fat and protein. Micronutrients are only needed in very small amounts. The prefix micro means small. Micronutrients are usually measured in milligrams instead of grams, and it's actually possible to get sick if you consume too much of certain kinds of vitamins. Vitamins and minerals are the main types of micronutrients. Their main function is to assist our enzymes in breaking down food so that your metabolism will be more efficient if you're getting the recommended amounts of all the vitamins and minerals. Everything around us, including living things and the nutrients we eat, are made of atoms. You might have heard of the 4 most common types of atoms in living things. They are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Most of the things you see around you are not made of a single element. They include multiple atoms bonded together in a combinations called molecules. Some types of molecules, called monomers, are subunits that can bind together to make long strings of monomers. The word mono means one. When 2 monomers are bound together, it makes a dimer. If we add a 3rd monomer bound to the other 2, it will be called a trimer. Tri means 3. When you have a lot of monomers bound together, it's called a polymer. Poly means many. So let's look a little closer at the structure of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made of monomers called monosaccharides. Saccharide is just a fancy word for sugar. If you're trying to recognize a picture of a monosaccharide, the 2 biggest ways to tell are the shape and the elements. Monosaccharides in the body look like either hexagons or pentagons, and they only have 3 elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The most common monosaccharide is called glucose, but fructose and galactose are also pretty common. You may have heard of fructose as being fruit sugar. In this diagram, you can see the process that enzymes use to put 2 monosaccharides together to make a molecule that, what do you think it would be called when there are 2 of them put together? If you said a disaccharide, you would be right. Remember that the prefix for 2 is called di. So in this top picture, 2 glucose monosaccharides are being added together to make the disaccharide maltose, which is malt sugar. It's found in a lot of cereals and grains like wheat. On the bottom, glucose is being added to fructose to make the disaccharide sucrose, which is the sugar that you can buy in the store for baking. If you look at a nutrition label and it says that your yogurt contains 19 grams of sugar, that includes both monosaccharides and disaccharides. In our bodies, cells break down sugars to get quick energy. They are faster and easier to break down than either fats or proteins, so if you're doing any kind of athletic competition or even working out your brain cells during an exam, it can be helpful to snack on something that has carbohydrates. Now, if you add many monosaccharides together, you will get a polysaccharide. These can be hundreds or even thousands of monomers long. On a nutrition facts label, the other carbohydrates that they sometimes include are polysaccharides. These are going to take a little bit longer to break down for energy than the shorter sugars. So most polysaccharides are used as medium-term energy storage or as structural support. So here are some examples. Starch. Starch stores energy in plants. If you think about starchy plants like potatoes or carrots, you might see a pattern. Many plants will store their extra energy in the roots as starch. Glycogen stores energy in animals. In humans, most of our glycogen is found in liver and muscle cells. In most people, it takes about 20 minutes of exercising to use up all of your glycogen and start breaking down mostly fats for energy instead. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of plant cells to give them support. This picture is actually showing cellulose. It's made of long chains of glucose that look very stringy. If you eat celery, that stringy green stuff that gets stuck in your teeth, that's cellulose. And cellulose is also the main component of wood in trees. Starch, glycogen, and cellulose are all polymers that are made only of glucose monomers, but they're bound together in different ways. Humans can't break down cellulose to digest it because of the way that the bonds are arranged is unrecognizable to our enzymes. When we eat cellulose, it goes all the way through our digestive tracts and ends up in our feces. On nutrition facts, cellulose gets labeled as fiber. And since fiber is bulky and absorbs a lot of water, it can make you feel full, but since it doesn't actually get absorbed for energy, it won't make you gain weight. Fiber also contributes to a healthy microbiome, since some of the healthy bacteria that live in your large intestine can digest the fiber that your own cells cannot. Chitin is another polysaccharide. It forms the exoskeletons, or shells, on the outsides of insects and crustaceans like shrimp. If you're into skincare, you might have heard of hyaluronic acid, which is a polysaccharide found in many products. It's also naturally produced by your skin cells and aids in repairing damaged skin and keeping your joint movements smooth and lubricated. Unlike carbohydrates and most proteins, fats are hydrophobic. Hydro means water, and phobic means fearing. When we say fats are hydrophobic, it means they don't mix or dissolve well in water. That's why it's really hard to clean an oily pot or pan with only water and no soap. Carbohydrates are the opposite. They are hydrophilic, which means water-loving. You might have mixed sugar and water together to make syrup before. The sugar dissolves in the water pretty easily, especially when you speed up the molecule motion by heating it up. The reason some molecules dissolve in others is based on tiny positive and negative charges on their atoms. Atoms that have charges can stick to other atoms that have the opposite charge and dissolve them. We sometimes say that like dissolves like. Atoms with charges dissolve in other atoms with charges. In this diagram, you can see tiny water molecules, the red and white ones, which have both positive and negative charges. The green and blue balls are part of sodium chloride, which is salt. When salt dissolves in water, the positive and negative charges on the water are sticking to the positive and negative charges on the sodium and the chloride in the salt. Some molecules do not have any positive or negative charges, and they will not dissolve easily in things like water that do have a charge. Can you guess whether carbohydrates have charged atoms or not? How about fats? Pause the video and take a guess. If you said that carbohydrates have charges and fats do not, you are right. That's why carbohydrates dissolve well in water and fats don't. Let's take a closer look at the structure of fats, or should I say, triglycerides. Do you remember what the prefix tri means? It means 3, and you can see these 3 long tails on the triglyceride on the left. Those three tails are long strings of just carbon and hydrogen bonded together, and those long strings are called fatty acids. On the left side, the vertical molecule here is called glycerol, and it's connected to all three fatty acids. Triglyceride is 3 fatty acids connected to glycerol. When you digest fats, 2 of the fatty acids are broken off by enzymes, and you're left with glycerol connected to a single fatty acid. This would be called a monoglyceride. So what are fats good for anyway? Everybody's always trying to lose fat. Well, fats are the most efficient way to pack a lot of energy into a small space. Remember, they had more than twice as many calories of energy for every gram of fat as a carb or a protein. If you had to store all of your energy as something like glycogen, a carbohydrate, you'd need a much bigger body size to have enough space for it all. Other uses of fats are for padding, so you have pads of fats around some of your organs to cushion and protect them, for instance, around the back of your kidneys. They're also good for insulation. Having a little bit of extra fat can help to keep you warm in the winter, so like everything, it's good to have a balance. On to proteins, the last and in my view most interesting of the macronutrients. When you think of proteins, you might just think of meat and muscle, but there's so much more. If you dried up all the water in your body, more than half of what remained would be proteins, and you have so many different kinds. Researchers estimate that humans have around 2 million different kinds of proteins in our bodies. And of those 2 million kinds, they each have their own unique shape, which in turn leads to unique functions. So in this diagram, the big red protein on the top is a protein spike on the outside of a coronavirus. And at the base of the spike, we have this shape here, which grabs onto the blue protein, which is a receptor on the outside of human cells. Receptors are normally used to receive signals from hormones and neurotransmitters, which would be the right shape to attach to the receptor. But viruses that have a similar shape can attach to our receptors and trick cells into letting them inside. So what is it about proteins that makes them so much more diverse than carbohydrates or fats? Well, carbohydrates only have a few kinds of monomers. We mentioned glucose and fructose and galactose. Whereas proteins have 20 different kinds of monomers. The protein monomers are called amino acids, and all of them contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Some amino acids can have extra elements as well. 9 out of the 20 amino acids are called essential amino acids, meaning you have to get them from the food that you eat. The other 11 amino acids can be made inside of your body. You can combine the 20 kinds of amino acids in any order. You can have repeats of the same ones. They can be hundreds of amino acids long, and a string of amino acids is called a polypeptide. Your DNA stores the code or recipes for how to make all the different polypeptides that your cells need. So the order of letters in your DNA determines the order of amino acids in your proteins. Because proteins are so complex, people often make really simplified drawings of them that look just like big blobs. So in the diagram on the right, you can see that the protein structure starts as just a long string of amino acids. Here it's simplified so that each amino acid looks like a little bead on a string. But then the amino acids fold back on each other and bond together in forms like this flat beta-pleated sheet or a spiraling helix. Then those sheets and helices curve back on each other to create what's called the tertiary structure of the entire polypeptide chain. And some proteins have more than one polypeptide stuck together, and the way that those different polypeptides fit together is called the quaternary structure of the protein. Let's look at some of the cool functions of proteins. So the background image here shows an antibody protein on the left, this large thing. These are made by your immune cells when you come into contact with bacteria, viruses, or vaccines that can contain dead or weakened pieces of bacteria and viruses. Sometimes your immune cells mistakenly think that something harmless like dust or pet hair is a dangerous virus, and they'll make antibodies to fight it. That's what causes allergies. You can see on this image that the antibody protein shape would fit quite well with the shape of this protein from a flu virus that's on the right. Antibodies attach to pathogens like virus or bacterial proteins to cover up the dangerous parts of those pathogens and neutralize them, and they also attract immune cells to the area to fight that pathogen. Another function of proteins is that some of them can act as switches to turn genes on and off. These are called transcription factors. Some kinds of transcription factors are gene activators, and others are gene repressors like the one in this animation here. So this would be a long string of DNA that contains multiple genes. Here we've called them the Z, Y, and A gene. And this region in front of the genes is where a protein can bind and act as a switch, and in this case it's a repressor protein that would turn these genes off. When a gene is activated, that gene's instructions are used to make another kind of protein. Humans have around 23,000 genes in each cell, but different genes are active in different cell types, like neurons, skin cells, and blood cells would each activate different kinds of genes. These transcription factors are also going to help cells change their behavior in response to the environment. So for example, if you get a cut, the cells near the cut will activate genes that cause them to grow and divide to make new cells to replace any that died when your skin was damaged. Another function of proteins is that they can be used for transport. So some, like the moving protein down here in the lower left, can move to let molecules go in and out of cells. This helps the cell to control what can get in and out based on what types of transport proteins they make by activating genes that make those transport proteins. Other transport proteins work on a larger scale. Red blood cells are full of a protein called hemoglobin, which attaches to oxygen in the lungs and transports it in the blood cell throughout the body and then drops it off at your cells, because all of your cells need oxygen to survive. Most hormones and receptors are also proteins. Hormones are chemical messages, so think of them as little postcards floating around in the blood. So in this picture, a red blood vessel here is traveling between two layers of cells, and the purple circles are the nuclei of those cells. Some of the cells have receptors on the outside, so that would be these little sort of Y-shaped or circular-edged or square-edged proteins right here. Those would all be receptors. So the hormones traveling in the blood are represented by these yellow triangles. And as the hormones travel, they kind of bounce around because all molecules are moving constantly. As they move throughout the blood, some of them might bump into a receptor that matches the shape of the hormone, and that is going to signal the attached cell to do something. So we can watch some of these other hormones travel throughout the blood, and it looks like this one also found a receptor that matches its shape. The other receptors can't attach to this particular hormone because it's the wrong shape. However, if a different hormone traveled through the blood, it might be able to activate those cells. This is a major way that hormones can activate some cells and not others. So for instance, growth hormone mainly activates cells in your bones and muscles for growth. It's not going to really activate your brain cells that much because they don't have the right receptor for the growth hormone. Other signaling molecules, like neurotransmitters and cytokines, are also proteins. So neurotransmitters signal neurons in the brain, and cytokines send messages between immune cells. So here's an example of how one hormone, insulin, works. So when you eat carbohydrates, they get broken down by enzymes, and the monosaccharides, like glucose, are absorbed into your blood. Remember that glucose is shaped like a hexagon. It's a monosaccharide, and they were hexagon or pentagon shaped. So these are glucose in this bloodstream. And the yellow molecule is still a hormone, in this case insulin. So when the blood glucose levels are high, cells in the pancreas, which is an organ kind of right here behind the curve of your stomach, are going to release the hormone insulin and release it into the blood. The insulin will travel all over the body, and some of the insulin will bump into insulin receptors, which are mainly on your liver and muscle cells. So here some insulin has bumped into this insulin receptor. When that happens, the insulin receptor is going to activate one of your genes in the nucleus of your cell. The gene will then make a transport protein, and that transport protein is called GLUT4. So this one is the GLUT4 transport protein. It will move to the cell membrane, and that GLUT4 transport protein is the right shape to move glucose into your cells. So as the glucose enters the transport protein, it will open on the other side and release the glucose into the cells. So because the glucose is now in your cells, the blood glucose levels will decrease. And the glucose inside of the cells can be converted into glycogen or fats so that you can store that energy for later. And some people have diabetes, which is a condition where in type 1 diabetes you don't make enough insulin, so the glucose stays high in the blood. And in type 2 diabetes, your insulin receptors stop recognizing the insulin. So you would also have high glucose in the blood in that case. Depending on the reason, you're going to have different kinds of treatments. But for instance, for type 1 diabetes, somebody can receive injections of insulin to replace the insulin that they are missing. So those were just some of the many functions of proteins. There are a few more. So in another video, I'm going to talk more about enzymes, which are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. When you think about chemical reactions, think of breaking things down like digestion, that's one kind of reaction, or building larger molecules, like when your DNA is used as the code to build proteins. Most of those processes without enzymes would take hundreds of years, and it would be way too long to sustain life. Imagine trying to take 100 years to digest a meal. So the enzymes are super important. Some other functions of proteins, you have contractile proteins that shorten muscles during movement. So if I were to contract this muscle, the proteins inside are going to move closer together, and that's going to pull my bones closer together and allow me to move my skeleton. Many cells and organs also contain structural proteins to hold their shapes. So when you think about like what makes a bone firm, a lot of it is structural proteins as well as some minerals. Some proteins can actually act as buffers as well, and they will prevent the pH of your body fluids from getting too acidic or too basic, which is really important. Muscle and neuron cells especially can't function unless they're at the correct pH. And think about one of your muscles is your heart. If your heart is unable to contract, you're going to die pretty quickly. I hope that you've come to appreciate just how impressive and important proteins are and how they fit in with the other nutrients.